The Oregon-bound immigrants who made it to Fort Hall were survivors. They had conquered the Rocky Mountains, avoided deadly diseases, and endured dozens of river crossings. 1,200 miles were behind them, less than 800 to go. Yet few of the immigrants realized that the most difficult segment of the trail was squarely in front of them. The steepest hills, the hottest desert, the meanest river. They would need to muster every ounce of their energy to complete the final steps. In the early 1840s, no emigrant wagon went further than Fort Hall. The few emigrants that did venture west from here used pack animals. But the huge wagon train of 1843 took a chance, blazing a trail to the west. John C. Bond was a member of that first wagon train.
Mrs. Looney says, prepare yourselves with good, strong clothing for the road, or the wild sage will trip you. This shrub is very plentiful and was hard on our teams. It will not be so bad on those that come next year, for we have left a well-beaten road all of the way.
From Fort Hall, the trail headed west along the Snake River. If an Indian attack was going to occur on the Oregon Trail, this was the most likely region. For years, the Hudson's Bay Company had been a calming force on the Indians. But when the British Fur Trading Company pulled out in the early 1850s, attacks on immigrants increased substantially. The best-known incident happened near here, a place now known as Massacre Rocks. It was Saturday, August 9th, 1862. Suddenly, without warning, an Indian attack. Within minutes, 5 immigrants were dead. The next morning, the survivors regrouped and fought back. In the resulting battle, 4 more emigrants were killed. There were other attacks along the Snake in the 1860s. Many felt a need to punish the Indians for their hit-and-run assaults. Colonel Patrick Connors, stationed in Salt Lake City, was among those who wanted to teach the Indians a lesson. And so in January of 1863, Connor and his California volunteers marched north to the Bear River. There, Connor's men wiped out 400 Shoshone men, women, and children. More Indians died at Bear River than any other battle in Western history. This brutal attempt at genocide did have its intended effect. The trail was safe for the immigrants. For a while. When the immigrants arrived at the Raft River, they faced the great choice. To the right was the standard route to Oregon. But after 1846, there was an alternative called the Applegate Trail. Although it was hailed as a safer route, the Applegate Trail never caught on with the Oregon-bound immigrants. Yet part of this alternate route did get heavy wagon traffic, beginning in 1849. But the travelers who veered south were not headed for Oregon. They were going to California. Many of them had no interest in farmland. They wanted gold. These were the 49ers, hungry for gold, instant riches. For over 1,000 miles, they struggled alongside the Oregon-bound immigrants. But eventually, they split off for California's gold country. They were mostly young men, naive young men.
Stories in the Richmond, Indiana paper is an example of big ad in the Richmond Palladium of 1849. This guy was selling salve. We got it in a bottle. And for $2.50 or $5 or something, you could get this bottle of salve. And all you did was rub it all over your body, get up on the top of the mountain and roll down, and all the gold stuck to you. And he guaranteed you by the time you got to the bottom of with one roll, you'd have enough gold when you scraped it off to come back and live happily ever after. That was all you needed. And he sold two types of salve, one for gold and one for silver. If you wanted to get some gold and silver, you used the other. Now, this is the type of thing that caused these young men of the day, the 17, 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old guys who the big end of the gold rush was in the first years, to go because, my gosh, I can live forever and happy the rest of my life. I can go out there and get money and go back. And ads like this were in the paper to whet their appetite.
Most of the California traffic would split off long before the Raft River. Some took the Hudspeth cutoff out of Soda Springs. Others passed through Salt Lake City, using either the Hastings cutoff or the Salt Lake alternate route. All told, over 250,000 split off for California. The Oregon-bound emigrants were now alone on the trail. No 49ers, no Mormons. The crowded trail wasn't so crowded anymore. A few miles down the Snake, a bizarre geologic feature, Thousand Springs. John Fremont.
Immediately opposite us, a subterranean river bursts out directly from the face of the escarpment and falls in white foam to the river below. A melancholy and strange-looking country, one of fracture and violence and fire.
Here the emigrants might have gotten their first taste of salmon, a welcome relief after months of doughy bread and salty bacon. A few miles further downstream came Three Island Crossing, and a difficult choice. Make a dangerous river crossing here for a more direct route to Fort Boise, or stay on the south side of the Snake and follow the river around the bend. About half made the decision to cross, using the islands as stepping stones. It would not be easy. Narcissa Whitman.
Husband had considerable difficulty crossing the cart. Both the cart and the mules were capsized in the water, and the mules entangled in the harness. They would have drowned but for a desperate struggle to get them ashore. Then, after putting two of the strongest horses before the cart and two men swimming behind to steady it, they succeeded in getting it over.
Regardless of which route they took, the emigrants were now facing one of the most difficult stretches of the Snake River Plain. It was now late August, and the flat land was hot, dry. No shade for the weary, no escape from the sun. Overton Johnson.
This is perhaps the most rugged desert and dreary country between the borders of the United States and the shores of the Pacific. It is nothing less than a wild, rocky, barren wilderness, or wrecked and ruined nature, a vast field of volcanic desolation.
For many, this is where scurvy began to set in. Anemia caused fatigue. Their gums bled. Some nearly went mad.
Well, there was one instance over by Mountain Home where the lady actually sat down and says, "I'm not going any farther." So the husband left her. And then she caught up with the husband, and in the meantime, the husband had sent the son out to tend some horses or something, and she told her husband that she'd based her son over the head with a rock. And so the husband rushes back there to see the son, and while the husband was rushing back, she set fire to his wagon.
Thankfully, there was relief ahead at Fort Boise. This outpost was originally built by the British Hudson's Bay Company to compete with American Fort Hall for fur. But by the 1840s, the fur trade was declining and the emigrants were increasing. The fort served the wagon trains throughout the 40s, but floods plagued the area. And by 1855, Fort Boise was gone. 8 years later, a new Fort Boise was built 50 miles to the east, and the city of Boise grew up alongside. Except for the start and finish, this was the largest city on the Oregon Trail. Over a century later, it still is. By the time the emigrants struck west from Fort Boise, it was mid-September. What if the snows came early, they worried? Would they be stranded in the mountains? Would they end up like the Donner Party, freezing to death, or worse yet, resorting to cannibalism? It was on the mind of nearly everyone as they hurried through these mountain passes. And they still had 400 miles to travel. Agnes Stewart.
Came 20 miles today. Hard on man and beast. Very warm. Nothing but hills and hollows and rocks. Oh dear, if only we were in the Willamette Valley, or wherever we are going, for I am tired of this.
A week or two after Fort Boise, the emigrants reached Grand Round. This circular valley was surrounded by something the emigrants had never seen before: western pine forests. Narcissa Whitman.
Grand Round is indeed a beautiful place. It is a circular plain surrounded by lofty mountains and has a beautiful stream coursing through it, skirted with quite large timber. The scenery, while passing through it, is delightful and the soil rich.
As the emigrants snaked their way through Dead Man's Pass, they now had only one thing on their minds: snow. It could fall at any time, threatening their expedition and their lives. This was the last stretch of trail in the notorious Blue Mountains. The entire trip had been scheduled to avoid snow here. Some were lucky, others were not. Then the trail coursed northward to the Whitman Mission. This was the place where Marcus and Narcissa Whitman finally ended their epic 1836 journey. Their small expedition was the first to bring families to Oregon by wagon. The Whitmans named their mission Wailetpu, place of ryegrass.
I think they were important for a number of reasons. One, because they were one of the first ones to go, and they did have wagons, even though it didn't make it all the way. They, in a sense, showed that wagons, immigrant wagons, could make it there.
In the early 1840s, the Whitman Mission became an important stop for the emigrants. There was a grist mill here and a blacksmith shop, and acres of crops. Narcissa Whitman.
The season has arrived when the immigrants are beginning to pass us on their way to the Willamette. Last season, there was such a multitude of starving people past us that quite drained us of our provisions, except potatoes. Husband has been endeavoring this summer to cultivate so as to be able to impart without so much distressing ourselves.
Beginning in 1845, most wagon trains took a shortcut that bypassed the Whitman Mission. Emigrants came here only if they were sick or low on supplies. In 1847, one of those emigrant wagon trains brought disease, measles, to the mission. The white children recovered, but the Indians had no resistance. Half the tribe died. In a fit of rage, 2 Cayuse Indians killed Marcus and Narcissa Whitman and a dozen others. The story of the Whitman Mission came to an end. A 100 miles to the west, a place called the Dalles, where the Columbia rumbled through a narrow chasm. It was here that Jason Lee set up a Methodist mission in 1838. History does not tell us how many Indians were converted at Lee's tiny outpost, but the Dalles did become a critical stop for the emigrants. That's because here the trail ruts came to a complete stop, blocked by the Cascade Mountains. But the Willamette Valley, the emigrants' destination was still 100 miles further on. In the trail's first years, there was only one solution: float the wagons down the Columbia. Because of the swirling rapids, the trip down the Columbia was especially treacherous. Lindsay Applegate.
One of our boats containing 6 persons was caught in one of those terrible whirlpools and upset. My son, 10 years old, my brother Jesse's son, Edward, the same age, were lost. It was a painful scene beyond description. We dared not to go to their assistance without exposing the occupants of the other boat to certain destruction, but the bodies of the drowned were never recovered.
Many emigrants soon realized they could not navigate the hazardous river themselves, so they hired experts, Indians. Overton Johnson.
It requires the most dexterous management, which these wild navigators are masters of, to pass the dreadful chasm in safety. A single stroke amiss would be inevitable destruction.
Even with Indian help, floating the Columbia was risky. Commercial ferrymen also set up shop, but their prices were outlandishly high. Even if an emigrant was willing to pay the steep fee, there were not enough ferry boats available to handle the flood of wagons rolling in. So here at the Dalles, they waited for days or weeks. As a result, a city was born. One man particularly angry about the high ferry boat prices was Sam Barlow, and so he devised a plan to build a road from the Dalles to the Willamette Valley, avoiding the Columbia altogether. Just one thing stood in his way: Mount Hood. But Barlow was determined, and in 1845, he and a few men began hacking and cutting their way through the forests of Mount Hood. The thick pine and steep hills proved to be difficult obstacles, but Barlow was determined. By 1846, the Barlow Road was finished, complete with toll gates. The charge, $5 per wagon. It was an immediate success. Emigrants willingly endured the steep inclines and sheer descents. This certainly was better than the ruinous rapids of the Columbia River. Or was it? Sarah Cummins.
The traveling was slow and toilsome. Slopes were almost impassable for man and beast. As night was coming on, it seemed we all must perish, but weak, faint, and starving we went on. I could scarcely put one foot before the another. I weighed less than 80 pounds at the time. My own party had been 14 days with only 9 biscuits and 4 small slices of bacon.
It was a real wicked route, but at least you went by dry land. You didn't have to drown in the Columbia River.
Finally, by land or by water, the final stop on the trail for many of the emigrants. It was Fort Vancouver, the massive British outpost on the north bank of the Columbia. Most of the emigrants were now very low on supplies and completely exhausted. Without help here, many would not live through the winter. George Curry.
A large proportion of the outfit has been consumed by the disastrous journey, and a well-to-do, thrifty-looking citizen and his family have been worn to a tattered band of hungry petitioners, begging his brothers of the earth. But there is one thing that was not diminished: our appetites.
Here they found help from a most unlikely source, a man named John McLaughlin. McLaughlin was head of Vancouver. His orders were to discourage the American emigrants, but he did just the opposite. McLaughlin offered the weary travelers food, medicine, he even organized rescue parties for emigrants in trouble along the way. They affectionately dubbed him the Father of Oregon. A few emigrants had the opportunity to visit McLaughlin's house at the fort, a rare dose of civility for the weary travelers. James Nesmith.
Dr. John McLaughlin, from his own private resources, rendered the new settlers much valuable aid by furnishing the destitute with food, clothing, and seed, waiting for his pay until they had a surplus to dispose of.
Of course, most of them finally wound up meeting Dr. McLaughlin, and he seemed to help everybody that came out. They were all more or less helpless when they got there, it seems to me. But he would always help them, seemingly, to point out places where they might go.
McLaughlin built Fort Vancouver into the center of culture in the West. Convinced the fort should be self-sufficient, McLaughlin had his men plant over 2,000 acres of vegetables, oats, and wheat. The first orchard in the West was here too, providing apples and pears. But McLaughlin was interested in more than just the necessities of life. The fort had a church, school, and library, even a theater. All quite astonishing to emigrants who had not seen a city for nearly 6 months. Yet Fort Vancouver was here long before the first emigrants. It was built in 1829 for one purpose only: furs. Indians from hundreds of miles away brought their furs to this room to trade for blankets or tobacco or beads. In 1845, this bastion was added, but not for protection against the Indians. It was a response to threats from the American government. But no battle ever came. The boundary dispute with Britain was settled peacefully. However, the treaty put Fort Vancouver on American soil. Trade diminished, and by the 1860s, the fort was gone. Across the river from Fort Vancouver, the final stop in the 2,000-mile-long trail. James Miller.
We swam our cattle over to the south bank of the Columbia, then hitched up our teams and drove 16 miles, arriving at Oregon City, capital of the provisional government. On our arrival in Oregon City, I found everything quite different from what I expected. There were 3 small churches, 3 stores, 2 blacksmith shops, 2 flour mills, and 1 weekly newspaper, the Oregon Spectator. My father purchased a house and lot, and we moved into it soon after we arrived, and commenced the sale of our boots and shoes. For fine boots, we got $5 a pair.
Overton Johnson.
We were happy after a long and tedious tour to witness the home of civilization, to see mills, storehouses, shops, to hear the noise of the workman's hammer, to enjoy the warm welcome of countrymen and friends.
From Oregon City, the emigrants fanned out in all directions to stake their claims, begin their new lives. They had reached the promised land.
The trail was over. They had made it. They had made it.
Well, I think they got more than what they expected on the way. I don't think they expected some of the hardships that they had and that they had to face. And I think once they got there, a lot of them were quite satisfied, because you still have a lot of their ancestors that are still there, and they take a lot of pride in the fact that, their great-grandparents came over the trail and they stayed there. So.
All of them wanted land, the first thing they wanted. Some of them would work in town in lumber yards and various things until they had enough money that they could buy themselves some food and stuff to go out and hunt for a piece of land. But it seemed to me it was all land, land, land.
And it was land that they got. The provisional government allotted 640 acres of this fertile Willamette Valley farmland to every male citizen. Sarah Cummins.
The giant fir trees, the healthful sea breezes, the strange sights and sounds were sources of continual thought. The long distance that separated us from our old home in the Mississippi Valley precluded any form of homesickness, and our efforts were wholly set upon the building of a home.
They soon learned that the legend of Oregon was true. The land was fertile, the weather mild. It didn't take long for word to spread across the nation, and the trickle of emigrants became a flood. 25 years after the first wagon train, they were still coming. All told, over 100,000 people came to this valley in covered wagons.
Nothing in American history compares to this, and the masses that come out. It's very unique.
I'd say the Oregon-California migrations combined are one of the 10 most important events in American history, ranking right up there with the Revolution, the Civil War, and anything else you can name.
That's because when the wagons rolled west, they took America with them. Its values, its ideals, and eventually, its government. And so the West was not won by cowboys or gunslingers. It was farmers, ordinary men and women who were willing to risk everything in search of a better life.
I think that made our nation what it is. As one nation, indivisible, crossing the country from Atlantic to the Pacific.
If they had known what they were in for, they might never have begun the journey. But in the end, they survived and prospered. An anonymous emigrant put it this way:
to enjoy such a trip along with such a crowd of immigration, a man must be able to endure heat like a salamander, mud and water like a muskrat, dust like a toad, and labor like a jackass. He must learn to eat with his unwashed fingers, drink out of the same vessel with his mules, sleep on the ground when it rains, share his blanket with vermin, and have patience with mosquitoes, who don't know no difference between the face of a man and the face of a mule, but to dash without ceremony from one to the other. He must cease to think, except as to where he may find grass and water and a good camping place. It is hardship without glory.
Yet it wasn't glory they were after.